Secretary General, for a very broad and wide canvas and for indeed suggesting a few answers for the future of NATO. Now, I would like to ask you in the audience to get your questions ready, and before I take them, let me ask you two questions myself. One on Libya, because you started, on Syria, because you started with Syria, and the second one on the future of NATO. We have just learned in the Syria case, and you mentioned it in your speech, that it's the credible threat of force that brings movement into a diplomatic situation. Now, it looks like the mandate that we will get out of the UN Security Council will not include such a credible threat, again, because some members of the Security Council won't allow this to be included. Now, what is the disarmament mandate for Syria worth without such a robust mandate? Is it worth anything?
First of all, let us focus on the good news. And the good news is that for the first time during this terrible crisis, the US and Russia have reached an agreement that now forms a framework for the elimination of chemical weapons in Syria. That is a huge step forward. It remains to be seen exactly how the UN Security Council resolution will look. But I think it's essential for keeping momentum in the diplomatic and political process that the military option is still on the table. And I think irrespective of the outcome of the deliberations in the UN Security Council, the military option will still be on the table.
All right, that's a very clear statement. Thank you very much for that. Now, on the future of NATO, in your speech, you mentioned political will, political commitment quite a lot, a number of times, and that you want more political commitment on the European side, and that, we need to develop and strengthen our own political will to be robust and rebalanced and ready. Now, let me ask this in a very simple way. Where do you see that primary source of political will in Europe to generate the political? Where is it coming from? Europeans don't feel particularly threatened. They don't feel particularly affected by the US pivot, if there is such a thing. Where are the sources of political will that you can identify that will get us where you want to get us?
Again, let me start with the good news. We saw in 2011 the Europeans step up to the plate and take on responsibility in Libya. After the adoption of an historic UN Security Council resolution to protect the Libyan population against attacks from its own government, the Europeans actually took the lead of the Libya operation. Having said that, we all know that it couldn't have been carried out successfully without significant support from and input from the Americans. But for the first time, the Europeans delivered the majority of assets for such an operation. So it's an example that despite economic austerity, the Europeans are ready to take more responsibility. But having said that, I share your concerns, and I think the Europeans should be aware of the strategic consequences of what we are witnessing right now. The fact is that if the current trend continues, if we see continued declining defense budgets, then one day the Europeans will not be able to participate in international crisis management as we saw it in Libya. And the vacuum Europe leaves behind will be filled by the other powers in the world, for instance, the emerging powers that actually invest more and more in defense and security. And eventually it means that Europe will lose influence on the international scene, Very often we in Europe praise ourselves of being standard bearer of basic fundamental principles like individual liberty, democracy, rule of law, human rights. And if we are sincere about promoting those values and defending those values, we also need the capabilities to actually underpin the soft power with some hard power. That's my clear position. So that's why I'm concerned about declining defense budgets in Europe.
So ultimately it's our values that will produce the political will, because we can't just neglect our values for too long before losing ourselves. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, exactly. And that's why I started with the positive example, Libya, because I think many people felt that fundamental principles were at stake. And we had a responsibility to act once the UN Security Council had adopted that historic resolution. So when it comes to fundamental principles, I think people realize we have to do something.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I think we'll start with questions now from all sides of the room. This gentleman was clearly the first one, and then this lady there in the middle, and then this lady over here, and then we take a second round after that, please.
Dr. Damien de George, founder of the Arctic Policy and Economic Forum. A delegation of NATO Parliamentary Assembly visited recently Greenland and Denmark to discuss Arctic issues, and the Assembly Subcommittee on Defense will write a report on NATO's role in securing the High North. How do you perceive the evolution of NATO engagement in the region? Thank you.
Thank you very much. The lady here in the middle, please.
Good morning. Is this working? Yeah. Alexandra Meyer-Hodal with the German press agency, DPA. You talked about NATO being important for defending values. I have a question for you about public perception. Are you worried at all that, people may say, well, NATO didn't or couldn't intervene in Syria? How are you defending values if you couldn't even go into a country where chemical weapons were being deployed? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And then we have the lady in red here in the middle, on the other side. There you go. Thank you.
Hello, Teresa Fallon, European Institute of Asian Studies. This is another question about fundamental values. You mentioned about Japan, for example, in April when you were there to talk about the partnership agreement and signed the agreement with Japan. It really skidded over regional tensions. China wasn't even mentioned. And this idea of a democracy, all of these issues in the region, NATO pretty much said we'll do everything like cyber, issues like that. And then immediately afterwards, a person flew to Beijing to brief the Chinese about what happened in Japan. So this kind of leads to questions about where NATO's support really is. I understand there are tectonic changes in the international scene, but how does NATO see future relations with China? And you mentioned in your speech you want to deepen and broaden your partnerships. How do you expect to do that in Asia? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And if you allow, I'll take another one. Yes, please. And then we go into answers after this.
Yes, Brooks Tigner, Jane's Defense. 2 quick questions. Russia and Damascus say they have proof that the rebels carried out the chemical attack in August, and it wouldn't be the first time that rebels in a conflict have killed their own people for propaganda purposes, as we've seen countless times in Afghanistan. So how open are you to the idea that the rebels may have done this? And second, on cyber defense, how do you expect to boost NATO's cyber defense capabilities to provide assistance to an individual ally that might come under attack when the NAC, the North Atlantic Council, is opposed to using common funding to do this? Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's a wide array. NATO in the Arctic, the inability or ability of NATO to do something in Syria. Then the question is, did the rebels actually commit or did they launch the attack that we are talking about? Cyber defense, and then Japanese-China relations.
Yes, yes, indeed. Thank you very much. First, on the High North, clearly climate change and melting ice in the north will, of course, have strategic implications. I mean, when new sea routes are opened, when we get easier access to resources in that part of the world, there will potentially, of course, also be a risk of more tensions. However, I do believe that countries in that region will do all they can to address these challenges peacefully and through negotiations. Among other bodies, they do have the Arctic Council as a framework for such peaceful resolutions of different problems, questions and challenges. But as regards NATO, I can assure you that we have no intention to increase our presence in the High North or to militarize the High North. But on the other hand, we have several allies, neighboring or even parts of their territories situated in what we call the High North. And obviously our allies would expect NATO to execute a collective defense in all parts of NATO territory, including territory in the High North. So I don't see any difference between NATO territory in the High North and NATO territory elsewhere. Our collective defense covers all NATO territory. Now, on Syria, I made the strong point that the credible threat of using military force facilitated the diplomatic and political process that eventually led to the American-Russian agreement in Geneva on elimination of Syrian chemical weapons. But don't make any mistake. When it comes to the long-term solution to the conflict in Syria, there is no military solution. We need a political settlement. And that's basically also why there is no call on NATO to intervene in Syria. But very often I get this question. People ask me, you conducted a very successful operation in Libya, so why couldn't you do the same in Syria? But let me remind you that Libya and Syria are two very different cases. In Libya, we operated on the basis of a clear United Nations mandate. In Libya, we got active support from partners in the region. None of these conditions are fulfilled when it comes to Syria. But on top of that, I think any foreign military intervention in Syria could have unpredictable regional repercussions. And this is a reason why we need a political solution to the conflict in Syria. But we should clearly distinguish between the long-term solution to the conflict in Syria and the specific response to the use of chemical weapons. The use of chemical weapons is a crime. It is a violation of international law, and that's why it needs a firm international response to prevent such attacks from happening again. That's why, right from the outset, I have been in favor of a firm military response. And that threat of using military force has now facilitated a political and diplomatic process that can lead to the elimination of chemical weapons in Syria. And that is, of course, a desirable outcome of this. So this is the reason why each and every case must be judged based on the specific circumstances. And there is no military response to all problems in the world. That's why Libya and Syria are two different situations. Now, on China and Asia. First on China. You pointed to one very specific thing, namely that NATO actually has a dialogue with China. Yes, we do. Occasionally, we have an exchange of views, and I don't think that is in contradiction with our desire to defend and protect basic democratic values. Very often, you will have to engage in a dialogue with counterparts that don't necessarily share your worldview. And I do believe that we have an interest in a dialogue with China. Let me remind you that NATO operates on the basis of United Nations mandates in Afghanistan, in Kosovo, counter-piracy, you mentioned it. All our operations are based on United Nations mandates. With 4 out of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, we do have special relations. 3 of them are, of course, allies, the US, UK, France. And with the 4th, Russia, we have a special partnership within the NATO-Russia Council. But with the 5th, China, we don't have a structured dialogue. And I think we have an interest in a dialogue with China, taking into account that we adhere to the fundamental principles of the UN Charter. So that's why we have a dialogue with China. But at the same time, we have developed and we are developing closer ties with what I would call like-minded partners in the Asia-Pacific region. We have signed an agreement with Australia. We have signed agreements with Japan. I was the very first NATO Secretary General to visit South Korea some months ago. We have these partnerships with what we call partners across the globe, because they contribute in a valuable way to our operations, and because we believe that in today's world we need partnerships to accomplish our security missions. I would like to stress this doesn't mean that NATO will be present in Asia, but we will engage with Asia, with individual nations in Asia. And I wouldn't exclude that we can develop similar partnerships with other countries, like-minded countries, in the Asia-Pacific region. Personally, I think there would also be a potential in strengthening and structuring our dialogue with India. Finally, returning to Syria, I think it's quite clear that a variety of sources point to the Syrian regime as responsible for the horrendous chemical weapon attack on the 21st of August. The missiles were launched from areas controlled by the government. It doesn't make sense for the opposition to attack their own people with chemical weapons in areas they already control. And furthermore, we don't think the opposition has at its disposal means to carry out a chemical weapons attack of that scope and scale. So based on the information I have no doubt that the Syrian regime is responsible for that chemical weapons attack. And finally, on cyber, we are currently considering how NATO could possibly assist allies that come under cyber attack. You asked me specifically, could we imagine NATO-owned and NATO commonly funded assets to be used to assist individual allies that come under attack? Let me remind you that it's not necessarily the only way to assist allies. When we are speaking about conventional attacks and conventional threats, we would usually deploy national assets to help an ally. Let me take the deployment of Patriot missiles to Turkey as an example. 3 allies agreed to deploy Patriot missiles to Turkey to augment Turkey's air defenses. And they are put under NATO command and control. They are not NATO-owned and they are not NATO commonly funded assets. They are national assets. And similarly, you could imagine within the cyber world that national assets come to assist an ally that come under attack upon request.
Thank you, Sec-Gen. What happens when you combine a super-performing 21st century military alliance with a super-performing 21st century think tank is that people can ask questions via Twitter. We've asked them to send in their stuff. And actually, I've selected 2 of these questions from the Twitter feed that we've received, and they actually fit with issues that you have raised. One comes from a student here in Brussels, Tommaso Crestodina, who is raising the EU issue that you have also raised. And his question is, could proper EU defense ever exist outside NATO? And so that question goes to you in this case, especially, of course, since the US is pivoting away. NATO relies very heavily on the US. So can the EU replace NATO? Can it ever exist outside NATO? What's your take on that?
I do believe that the 2 organizations should work together in a complementary way. I do believe it would be waste of resources to duplicate and have, so to speak, an independent EU defense organization in parallel with a similar NATO defense structure. I think that would be duplication. It would be waste of resources. 22 nations are members of both organizations, and they only have 1 set of military forces and 1 set of taxpayers. So I think the way to ensure effective defense is clearly a kind of division of labor, so that within the EU Common Defence and Security Policy, you could initiate specific operations where EU countries, possibly assisted by partners, conduct operations, as they do already in Africa, in Bosnia, as another example. And NATO will conduct operations in other theaters. In some theaters, we will operate alongside each other, as we do in Afghanistan. There is an EU police mission, and of course ISAF. In Kosovo, we have KFOR, we have EU legs. So there is a variety of cooperation patterns. But personally, I think it would be a waste of resources to build a parallel EU structure with headquarters and command and control systems, and you mentioned it. I mean, we have that system already in NATO. So I think a majority of NATO allies and also EU member states would say, let's use the systems we already have.
All right, I think that answers that question sufficiently. Now there's something else. You mentioned the upcoming NATO summit next year. And out there, obviously, there are people who send in their questions and who have very different ideas as to what should be on the agenda there. For them, threats sound very different from the threats that we usually talk about. Iveta Chernova, who's a security and defense analyst, writes, will climate change, international finance, and energy security be part of the agenda for the next NATO summit? A nice indicator as to what people out there also see as potential threats that maybe NATO should be dealing with.
Yeah, implicitly it will, of course. I mean, the financial crisis has an impact on defense budgets, as I've already said. So there is a direct link between the investment in military capabilities and our financial capabilities. That's also why I have launched the concept of smart defense. That, of course, we can't expect a lot more money for defense in the near future. So we have to make the most out of what we do have. And the way to make more efficient use of resources is to go for collective solutions to achieve synergies by helping each other, specialize and prioritize, all under the headline smart defense. And I have already mentioned climate change as a factor that, of course, also have security or strategic implications when it comes to security, and energy security is all over. So these issues will not be put on the agenda as specific items on the agenda, but implicitly they will, of course, have an impact on our deliberations.
All right. Thank you very much. Let me add another one, very quick one from myself. You mentioned the NATO response force in your speech. Now, most of us looking at NATO and looking at European defense think that, of course, this is one relatively big disappointment. And that it has never really, functioned and worked the way that we envisioned it to work. Do you think that this NRF tool that we've given ourselves can ever amount to something?
Indeed, it will be revitalized. It was invented some years ago, and you're right. So far, it hasn't played a strong role. But there is one specific reason why the NATO response force hasn't been prominently placed in the eyes of the public. And that is, we have been so engaged in Afghanistan that our allies and our partners didn't feel a strong need for exercises, because we exercise on a daily basis in real time and real world in Afghanistan. But my point is that as we draw down in Afghanistan, we will have to step up joint exercises, training and education to maintain and further develop the ability we have developed in Afghanistan to work and operate together. And that's why the NATO response force will get a more prominent role in the coming years.
All right, excellent. Thank you very much. Two more questions. This gentleman over here, and then to this side, Terry, please.
Secretary General, Tijn Sade for Dutch NRC Handelsblad and NOS Radio. You mentioned the need to invest more by European members to share the burden. You probably have heard about the Dutch government decided to invest in 37 new joint strike fighters. You've heard about that, or? Yeah. An enormous burden, 4.5 billion euros. Apparently, the Dutch government is willing to take that burden. My question to you is, what kind of coordination is there in Europe with sharing this burden? Is the Netherlands the only country investing so much? Are there other countries that have a more cheap, free ride? Could you comment on that?
All right, excellent. And then on this side here, I think we'll probably add another question, but Terry goes next.
Thank you, Jan. Hello, Mr. Secretary General. You say that you believe the Syrian regime was responsible, and you also say that you believe anyone who uses chemical weapons should be held accountable. Do you really think that taking away the weapons so it can't happen again is sufficient for holding the regime accountable for what you and most others believe has already happened? What should happen next in that process? And also a question on European defense. Yesterday we heard at JFC Brunsum that allies and partners are operating nearly seamlessly now, and that Steadfast Jazz will simply reinforce that. But if what has happened in Afghanistan and also the Libyan operation pointed out very specific shortfalls in European spending, if these very specific exercises haven't convinced the Europeans they need to spend more on their capabilities, what do you expect will do it? Thanks.
All right, excellent. And then this gentleman at the aisle there, that's the final question we're going to take.
Nawab Khan from the Kuwait News Agency, Kuna. Mr. Secretary General, do you think there should be a time limit set for the finding and destruction of the chemical weapons in Syria? I ask because Mr. Bashar al-Assad today in a TV interview said it will take 1 year and cost $1 billion, and this should be paid by the US. And my second question is on your proposal to boost regional cooperation with organizations like the Gulf Cooperation and the Arab League. Have you any concrete proposals on this? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Again, a number of Syria questions, but also the coordination on defense burdens, the shortfall in exercises that became obvious, and a time limit for the removal of these chemical weapons in Syria.
Yeah. First, on holding those responsible accountable, basically, of course, or eventually, I would say, it is also a question of international law and using the international legal system in that respect. There is no doubt that chemical weapons have been used. There is no doubt that the use of chemical weapons is a crime, a violation of international law, and I think it should be dealt with within an international legal system. While I still do believe that the threat of taking military action has facilitated a diplomatic and political process, and that options should still be on the table to maintain a momentum in that diplomatic and political process. Now, on timelines, I think we have seen quite ambitious timelines outlined in the framework agreement that was agreed between the Americans and the Russians in Geneva. And I think we should stick to the timelines that have been agreed between the two parties. Now, on defense investments, first of all, let me stress that it is a national decision how and when individual allies will invest in military capabilities, including renewal of the fleet of fighter aircrafts. That's the first thing. Secondly, you asked me whether there is a coordination within NATO, and the answer is yes. We do have what we call a NATO defense planning process, within which allies try to coordinate in such a way that overall we do have the right capabilities to address future challenges. When it comes to the acquisition of fighter aircrafts or other kinds of military equipment, it would, of course, be a good idea if nations pursue joint acquisition and collective solutions. Again, it's a national decision, but let me point to at least one example from the past that I know very well, because my own country, Denmark, participated in that. In the 70s, 4 NATO allies acquired F-16 fighter aircrafts in a joint project. Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, and later, by the way, Portugal joined that consortium. And I think, if I remember correctly, we purchased 348 F-16s, and you can imagine that we achieved a lot of synergies. Like in private households, you get a rebate if you buy in big quantities. So obviously, there is good economies in pursuing such joint acquisition of expensive military equipment. And it's not only about acquisition, but because afterwards we also joined efforts when it came to maintenance, training, education, and on a couple of occasions also deployment of these F-16s. So there is a lot of synergies to achieve through joint acquisition of, for instance, fighter aircraft. But having said all that, it's a national decision. Now, are the Europeans convinced that they should invest more in critical military capabilities? Based on the discussions I have heard among political leaders in European capitals, I think there is a growing awareness that, based on the lessons learned, not only from Libya, but also from other operations, that we need more investments in critical military capabilities to fill the gaps. Of course, the challenge right now is that all governments in Europe are under pressure, under budgetary pressure. And as a politician, I know very well what is the challenge. I mean, when you are forced to cut your budgets across the board, including welfare programs, educational programs, health programs, it's almost political suicide to suggest that the Minister of Defense should be exempted from that exercise. That is the political reality we are all faced with now. Nevertheless, I have seen examples, positive examples recently. I have visited allies. I have spoken with their parliamentarians. That's now always an integrated part of my programs, that I meet parliamentarians. And I have discussed it with them. And in a number of parliaments in allied nations, we have now seen broad political agreements that they will gradually increase their defense spending. They will gradually move towards the NATO 2% benchmark. You know, we have a benchmark according to which individual allies should strive for reaching a level of defense investment equivalent to 2% of GDP. Only a very few lives up to that, and it's not a legal obligation. It's a political goal, it's a political commitment. But the good news is that I have now seen a number of examples that in parliaments a broad coalition of parties have agreed to gradually move towards that goal. At least that is an attempt to reverse the trend. And let me mention one example which is outstanding, I think. A few years ago, Estonia suffered severely from the economic crisis. Nevertheless, Estonia has succeeded in achieving the 2% goal. It's a shining example. It's a question of priority. You can, if you have the political will, and I see that political will in a number of allied nations.
Can I interrupt very briefly here, because we are all burning to learn who these examples are?
Yeah.
Can you give us names, or is that impossible at this stage?
I could, but I think it's for them to publish their intentions.
Okay.
But I have the list, yes.
All right.
But I'm also used to protect classified information. But I think...
note to self, we have to find that list.
Actually, I think some of them would be happy to publish it themselves. But again, as I told you, politically it is a bit sensitive issue, because if you, with the one hand, cut in welfare programs, and with the other hand, increase defense investments, you may be faced with domestic political problems. So it's not always highlighted. But I have noted it in my book.
All right.
That's the good news. Finally, about partnerships, we have some ideas. My vision would be to see partners well integrated in our smart defense and connected forces initiatives. I mean, connected forces, for instance, to connect our forces to make sure that they maintain and develop their ability to work and operate together. That's very important, not just for allies, but also for partners.
I have a question on perceptions of NATO in other parts of the planet. You mentioned NATO not being a global policeman, but that NATO needs to develop its awareness of the rest of the world. And China, of course, is the big strategic question of the day. Now, we at Carnegie conduct a series of video conferences between NATO headquarters and our office in Beijing. And then we bring in Chinese scholars, Europeanists, defense scholars, some of them actually with a NATO specialization. And they know a lot about NATO. They know about documents and questions and political issues of the day. And then you have these wonderful discussions, and then something strange happens in these discussions. After about an hour, when you think everything's wonderful and you've really done a great effort, then all of these people, and they are the cream of the crop on the Chinese side, will completely subscribe to the idea that NATO is just another building block in the idea of Western encirclement of China. We're out there to get them. It's a big conspiracy, and NATO is one element in this. And they believe that. I mean, you press them on this, you think, you want to pull your hair out after that nice discussion, and then you get that kind of message. What's your message for these people?
First of all, that it demonstrates the need for dialogue and exchange of views so that misperceptions can be avoided. And that's, of course, a very important part of our dialogue with the Chinese. And secondly, it is my clear view that in today's world, we need to strengthen what we call cooperative security. We want a China that plays a constructive role in upholding international peace and security. We have the same goal. Our only intention is to engage in that dialogue with China and ensure that we can complement each other in upholding international peace and security. And finally, I think it's also important to tell the Chinese that in a number of areas we do have common security interests. One issue, of course, is maritime security, particularly when it comes to counter piracy. Also, the Chinese are very much dependent on global trade, free sea lanes, and actually we cooperate with the Chinese when it comes to counter piracy.
Very good. I think we take another round of questions, so I'm waiting for your hands. There's the lady here. No, it's not a lady. This is a gentleman. I'm sorry. Then there's somebody all the way in the back, and then we have Ambassador Pirini, and then we'll see where we are with this. And I'm might want to take another one. So it's this gentleman here first.
Thank you. Good morning, Secretary General. How do you want to stabilize a region as large as Northern Africa and the Sahara region, where the Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb seems to be getting stronger and find places to hide, and illicit arms are spreading? Is the support of non-democratic governments like Morocco an answer for this?
Thank you very much. And then there's another question all the way in the back. Yes, please.
Yeah, good morning, first of all. 3 days ago, the Turkish Air Force shot down a Syrian helicopter at the border after the helicopter violated the Turkish airspace. I just wonder how do NATO evaluate this action taken from Turkey?
All right, another one. And Ambassador Pirini, all the way here in the front, had another question.
Yeah, Secretary General, about 9 hours ago, NBC released an interview of the Iranian president. Mr. Rouhani said, "We never pursued or sought a nuclear weapon, we'll never do so." What's your comment on this?
All right, and I think this leaves us space for another question. I saw a few arms up there. I think this gentleman on the side there, yes.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Vincent Hebin. I'm representing the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs in Brussels. I have a question on Afghanistan. We are increasingly concerned that the security situation is deteriorating in many parts of the country, that we have more and more casualties among women and children in particular due to explosive remnants of war and exploded ordnance. But we're also increasingly concerned about the humanitarian access in the country and what will happen as the troops are withdrawn from Afghanistan. I would like that if you could share your views on engagement with the Afghan authorities and what the prospects are with regards to how we deliver humanitarian aid and how we reach the people affected and how we deal with unexploded ordnance and other remnants of war. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's the first reference to Afghanistan, I guess, and this thing, which is an interesting development. Stabilization of the area, Syria, Iran, and then Afghanistan.
Yeah, first on North Africa. Yes, developments are a matter of concern. As I indicated in my introduction this morning, I think one possible way forward when we are speaking about NATO is to develop within NATO a capacity to help partners and individual nations to develop their own capacity to deal with security challenges. I mentioned Libya as an example, and obviously the security situation in Libya is a matter of concern, and the Libyan authorities have requested our assistance to develop their security sector. We have right now an expert team in Libya to explore the possibilities further, and I think that's one way in which we can contribute to stabilizing the situation in North Africa, that we can help individual nations in the region to develop and strengthen their own security sector. On the helicopter incident, the Turks have informed NATO about that incident, and according to that piece of information, the helicopter had violated Turkish airspace, and that's why the Turkish authorities reacted as they did, and I have no reason to doubt the information we have received from Turkey. On Iran, I have been very encouraged by recent statements and indications from the new Iranian leadership, notably, of course, the president. I hope it will open possibility for a political and diplomatic solution to the dispute on the Iranian nuclear program. I think it's also in Iran's self-interest to engage constructively with the international community. And if what we have seen from the new Iranian president is an indication of a desire to engage in a more positive way with the international community, I could only welcome it. On Afghanistan, first of all, yes, we have seen a number of spectacular attacks, and of course they are a matter of concern, in particular because the targets very often have been civilians in Afghanistan. In that respect, let me stress that numerous United Nations reports show that the Taliban and other enemies of Afghanistan are responsible for a huge majority of civilian casualties and fatalities in Afghanistan. We have really done a lot to minimize civilian casualties caused by our actions in Afghanistan. Having said that, and realizing that we have seen and we will see a number of spectacular attacks in Afghanistan, I also have to add that according to our statistics, we have seen a decline in the number of attacks in recent weeks compared to the same period last year. Furthermore, we are witnessing an increasing capability of the Afghan security forces to address the security challenges in Afghanistan. Of course, you ask the same question as many people would ask: what will happen when we complete our ISAF combat mission by the end of next year? And the answer is that in the meantime, we have built up a very strong Afghan security force. And while there is still a lot to do, we have seen a strengthened capability of the Afghan security forces, and they have addressed recent security incidents in a very professional manner. So I'm confident that they will be able to take full responsibility for the security by the end of next year when we complete our ISAF mission. When it comes to excessive munitions and unexploded munitions and remnants, etc., I think that's one of the issues we should address within our future partnership framework. It's our intention, if the Afghans agree, to engage in a long-term partnership with Afghanistan, similar to other partnerships we have developed during recent years. And within those partnerships, we are also able to assist individual nations with the demolition of excessive munitions, remnants, etc. So that's at least one possibility, that we can engage in a cooperation with the Afghan authorities in that respect.
We all understand that you are a professional optimist on Afghanistan, obviously. often the security community finds it a bit hard to believe that we are actually really on the kind of track for a self-sustained security situation. But I don't want to dwell on this too much because it's a tricky issue and it's not our main subject today. I would like to ask you a final question before we actually conclude here today. You're from Denmark, obviously, but you've also visited, as the first NATO Secretary General, Ireland, which is a neutral country, takes pride in its neutrality, but is also agonizing over its neutrality. What is going to happen first? Ireland joining NATO or Denmark joining the European defense policy?
Yeah, it's a difficult question, but I think there's a fair chance that Denmark would join the EU defense policy first. Based on what I have learned in both countries, yes, I think there is a fair chance. The fact is that actually there is a broad political agreement in the Danish parliament that the Danish exception from the EU defense policy is absurd. And it is damaging for Danish interests. And hadn't it been for the euro crisis, I think that question would have been put to a referendum long ago. But you also have to understand that the whole euro crisis casts a shadow over many EU questions. So it's very difficult for a government to put any EU question to a referendum right now. And I think that's my analysis. That's a basic reason why it hasn't been done already. Because there is a clear sense in Denmark that that Denmark should participate fully. Let me remind you that Denmark, for quite some years, has pursued a very activistic foreign and security policy. Denmark is a very active contributor to many international military operations, and obviously it's absurd that the only kind of military operations that Denmark can't contribute to are the EU-led operations. So I'm sure one day that exception will be removed, but it requires a referendum.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for ending on a note of hope and optimism. Thanks again for joining us at Carnegie for the discussion about the future of NATO and European security. Good luck for the time to the run-up of the new summit and for the projects, the big projects that you've taken on as your own homework. And we hope to see you again at Carnegie Europe at some point in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.